Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell, and if you've been following me for a little while, you will know that I love adding civilizations to Age of Empires 2. However, Age of Mythology is, to me, an even better candidate. There are so many incredible mythologies out there in this world that could fit perfectly into this fantastic game, and as such today, we will be asking, what Age of Mythology cultures could we add to the game just from Western Europe? Specifically, as I'll be getting into momentarily, just the British Isles and France. Special credit, by the way, to longtime viewer and collaborator Temidon. He has been a great help with this project, and you'll be seeing his name in future. So big thanks to him. Give him some love down in the comments. Let us begin this discussion with a brief overview, as always, of my approach. When I'm talking about Age of Mythology, I'm trying to be true to the myths. Pop culture is almost never a factor in my analysis of a civilization or my implementation thereof. I also almost never add something just for balance. I want some sort of grounding to justify it. I'm trying to make my designs believable, but boundary pushing. I actively prefer complex designs, and I believe that the more civilizations and cultures in the game, the better. I'm a hobbyist, not a trained classicist, so I get stuff wrong all the time. If you see a mistake, please let me know, and apologies in advance for any pronunciation mistakes, though I do try my best. If you want to support me on this channel, please like and subscribe, leave a comment because I want to hear your input, support me on Ko-Fi if you have a couple bucks, and go join our Discord, all linked in the description down below. With that, let us preface this topic with a brief discussion of who qualifies for this list. Like I mentioned, I'm almost solely focusing on Britain and France here. I'm going to be saving Spain, Germany, and all sorts of other nearby regions for future videos. So before you ask me where those are, that's where they are. They are in the future. So why do I have such a narrow scope here? Length. I have 14 cultures to go over in this video, and if I were to expand the scope, that would make it even longer than it already is. I'm also focusing on a pre-Renaissance time frame, with a semi-arbitrary cutoff of like the 1500s-ish AD. Though there might be some exceptions, there are quite a few myths that I will be discussing today that were only recorded well after the 1500s, but likely had origins much earlier, and in my mind, all of those qualify in full. Now, I should note, there are plenty of high medieval cultures on this list who are like post the existing Age of Mythology cutoff of the Norse, but I do think high medieval civilizations can easily belong in Age of Mythology, though I do have them ranked slightly lower in general on this list. I do 100% believe that latter cultures, especially high medieval, but even like Renaissance and beyond cultures, could work in Age of Mythology, but I will largely be saving those for another day and another discussion, because they would change the game's dynamics pretty substantially. I also am going to be trying to break down umbrellas where possible. Umbrellas here are referring to cultures that I think have more than enough material to qualify for several cultures that could be subdivided out of them. And on this list, I will be featuring a number of umbrellas because I think they're quite likely, but also their subdivisions, which I personally want to see more. Wherever I believe there is enough material for multiple cultures, I will almost always try to make it work. Like I said earlier, the more the merrier is my philosophy. And frankly, most of the cultures that I have on this list could probably be split much further than they are, but this is my somewhat arbitrary cutoff based on the amount of material I see out there and my own kind of gut instincts of what I could probably make work in practice. Another thing I'm going to be talking about on this list is mythic cultures. So the existence of the Atlanteans annoys me personally for a multitude of reasons that I get into in this video. Go check it out if you haven't already. But it does open the door to many possible and far better legendary peoples who are not historically grounded but are mythically grounded. Quite a few of these mythical cultures rank on this list, but I tend to have them much lower. Both because I don't think they are likely to be added, but also because I would like to see more real-world cultures represented before we dive into the mythic stuff. Though I do still think the mythic stuff is very important. Last note, this list is not predictive. Well, I mean, it's kind of predictive. It's ordered by likelihood. However, it does include many unrealistic propositions, which I'll be getting to later. And also, a lot of the factions that are ranked low on this list are ones that I personally want a lot. But the ordering is in no way a value judgment on the cultures, nor representative of what I would personally prefer, nor is it meant to be a hard and fast prediction. Now, let's get into the top contenders. There are two, and we're going to try to dive into them pretty quickly. Bear in mind, all of these are extremely rough drafts, and if I were to do a full build, it would likely end up looking very different from what you see here. So, First and foremost, the Gaels. Who were the Gaels? Well, they are a broad umbrella encapsulating the Celtic peoples of modern Ireland, Scotland, and adjacent, not to be confused with the Brythonic Celts, who I'll be getting to momentarily. I had the Gaels as number 5 on my original Age of Mythology cultural predictions list, which you can check out up there. I am very passionate about Gaelic mythology myself. I have a lot of interest in it, and I 100% think that they could be a major contender in the game. You have gods like Dagda, the king of the gods, fertility and strength, Brigid, who is a goddess of healing and inspiration, the Morrigan, who's the triplicate goddess of war. There are tons more than these, but these who I would see as maybe the major gods of the Gaels, unlike my original list where I gave a different set. For myth units, you have a ton. You have the Merrow, who are like a type of mer people, the Darhu, who are like a killer otter thing, Kelpies, the famous shape-shifting water horses. There are many options, both well-known and more obscure, though of course if the Gaels were to be actually implemented, they would probably go for some of the more pop culture-y stuff. Now, to note about the Gaels, I love Gaelic mythology, and I happen to know a lot about it. And because of that, I can very confidently say that there is more than enough material to split this umbrella manyfold. So even though I would love to see the Gaels in-game, I would even more love to see them subdivided, which I'll be getting into momentarily. I would also, of course, be reusing a lot of the god myth ideas I have listed here for the sub-split factions, but I'm going to be keeping later entries fresh for variety's sake. So I'm not going to just like relist the same myth units and gods for a bunch of factions, even if they could be reused on them. I don't plan on doing a build for the Gaels. Instead, I want to be doing builds on its subcultures, who I am personally more interested in having represented rather than this big goofy umbrella. Though I will say, Gaels is much more likely, of course, and possibly even more likely than that would be a Celts faction, but I just really hope we don't get that. There's just too much good stuff across all of the pan-Celtic world to be crammed into a single culture. That would be genuinely ridiculous to me. So, no Celts. I reject that. Gaels by itself would be a bit of a tragedy to me, though obviously it would be awesome to see in the game. Now, past the Gaels, the Brythons, or the Britons, if you wish. These would be another big umbrella of the many non-Gaelic Celtic peoples of England specifically. The Welsh, the Picts, the Cornish, and many others. They would bring to the table a pretty unique blend of Celtic pagan and like early Christian beliefs, which were often kind of muddled and merged together all around the British Isles as is, including among the Gaels. And this culture would cover a huge block of history and would probably end up being focused in on like an early medieval time frame, but with influence from all sorts. Now, in terms of major gods, I have some kind of unusual options here. Obviously, the various Brythonic mythologies have tons of different god options, but I thought these ones, if you had to do like a pan-Brythonic umbrella faction, some of the best ones would be, for example, Nimue, the Lady of the Lake, as well as the Fisher King, a recurrent kind of otherworld guardian in Arthurian mythos, and maybe even Taliesin the Chronicler, who was a bard who later was kind of deified, but also was more of like a hero in his own works. It's a confusing thing. You could even have Bede be elevated to the status of a saint as a major god, which I'll be getting into a bit more later. All of these are very arguably not gods. Same with a lot of Brythonic mythology, which got adapted through a Christian lens later down the line to undeify many of these characters. So if you didn't want to call these gods, you could call them saints instead. I'll be talking about saints quite a lot in this video. My idea is that for quite a few cultures who didn't really have gods as we understood it now, you could have their major and minor gods be major and minor saints, with the general idea being that saints would be maybe like cheaper and easier to get to, but had lower power overall. I like the option a lot. For myth units, they have a ton. You could do the Puka, which is like a shape-shifting goblin thing, the Sea Morgan, which is kind of like a siren water spirit, the Gwilgi, which is like a toxic hellhound, super freaking cool. They have a lot of stuff. We'll be getting into more of these later on. But notably, this is another enormous umbrella that I fully intend on splitting. I would be quite sad to have the Brythons all lumped together into a single faction. And I will say probably the single most likely piece out of all Brythonic mythos to actually get into the game would be Arthurian mythos, which again, I'll be covering in more detail shortly. Just suffice to say, if you're going to have a Brythonic umbrella, it would probably mostly focus on Arthur. I thought it would be maybe cool to have like a gimmick for this faction where you were like chronicling the game as you played it. Maybe as the way of getting favor, you'd have to have like storytellers near great battles and stuff. But I haven't really developed the idea much, so I'm not going to share much more about it. If I were to do a full build, I'd probably have that in there. And I do plan on subdividing this culture, so maybe that chronicling gimmick will show up elsewhere. But that brings us to the end of our top contenders. Only two, and two that I'd be kind of sad to actually have in the game. But now we get into the good stuff. The mid contenders that are less likely, but in my opinion, way, way cooler. Beginning with the Gauls. As an overview, the Celtic peoples of France predominantly, though they originated elsewhere, maybe even from Anatolia, and were spread much further across Europe before Rome and a whole host of other issues kind of forced them on the back foot, eventually causing them to assimilate into different peoples over time. The Gauls here would be kind of a messy umbrella for mainland Western European Celts, mostly focusing on like the late Iron Age. If you know Asterix the Gaul, kind of like that, but more historical and less fun and cartoony, though I do love Asterix. For major gods, there are so many once again. Totatis, the god of the tribe. Belinus, the god of healing, who might have been like the king of the gods even over Totatis. Cernunnos, the god of shamans and the wilds. Within Gallic mythology, you can see a lot of the roots that you see in other parts of Celtic mythology as well. For myth units, we don't know much about the Gauls' mythical creatures, and so instead I used some older French mythical creatures instead, such as the Bugulno, who is like a nighttime boogeyman, the Jetin, which is like a stone-hurling dwarf thing, and the Groach, who is like a shape-shifting water crone. These, of note, are mostly hailing from Brittany, which I'll be getting into later, which is kind of a hotbed of Celtic mythology in and of itself. So I think, in summary, the weakest part of the Gauls would be their myth unit options. You'd have to get a little creative with those. Though the Breton mythical creatures probably originated from ancient Celtic tradition, so it's not that much of a cheat. I'm not as confident that the Gauls could be split, even though they are a huge umbrella. We know of dozens of mainland, major Celtic tribes, but I'm just not sure there's enough material to subdivide them effectively, especially, again, in terms of myth units, and also in terms of which gods they differently prioritized. So if you happen to know anything about mainland Celts and you think there's potential for a subsplit, please let me know down in the comments, on Discord, anywhere. Same with their mythical creatures. I really need leads on this. I'm pretty confident about British Isles mythology stuff, but not so much the mainland Celts. So leads would be appreciated. Even so, I think the Gauls are more likely than the next one, the Irish. This would be kind of the primary subdivision of the Gaels faction, covering pre-Christian Ireland, plus a lot of the ambiguous pagan Christian transition period in the 4 to 500s AD, a little bit beyond as well. If you're at all familiar with the material, this would be mostly focused on the Ulster and Fenian cycles, though of course plenty of adjacent material would be covered as well. I would see the Irish as being a raiding civilization focused on mobile, cheap armies. Their heroes, like I mentioned in that original prediction video, could be the Rifaine, with leading bands of Fian warriors that would have to stick together as a group to get maximal benefits. And for major gods, they have so many, many of whom could be repeated from earlier entries, but some other ones we could talk about could be Lu, the kind of golden boy who defeated the great evil of Balor to rise to the head of the Tuatha De Danann, Nuada of the Silver Hand, a great king of the Tuatha De, who eventually fell in battle defeating their ancient enemies, or Manannán, an interesting lord of the otherworld who is also a god of the sea and a psychopomp. I really like him. I think he's a very underrated god. For myth units, literally endless options. The Bogain, like a horse ogre thing. The Fermach was like an invincible hound. You could do a whelp of Fermach instead because there was only one of him. The Elaine Trehend, who is like a three-headed bird dragon thing. Super duper cool. There are so many mythical creatures in Ireland. There are no shortage of options here. And frankly, they're one of the main cultures I'd want to kind of spread the love out to some of the other subcultures because they just have such an abundance of mythical creatures. In terms of other notes, I could maybe see using a different name than Irish. I get the impulse to use something more recognizable, but a more authentic name would be something like Eirene, which I think would be pretty cool, personally. You could hypothetically cover all of Irish history and lore in this civilization, but I think there's space for a good deal more cultures here than just that, though this would be kind of the flagship of Ireland. And the reason I think that is particularly because of the distinct Christian-pagan distinction between early and later Ireland. I think that trying to reconcile that in one faction would be kind of messy. And in my opinion, this is the easiest and most likely of all of the Gael subdivisions, and if we were to maybe dodge Gaels as a faction in game, this would probably be what we started with. Another option that we have, another very likely option in my opinion, would be the Welsh. This would broadly cover pretty much all of post-Roman Welsh history and lore, up until like the Norman conquests in the late 1100s AD. This would largely be drawing from the Mabinogion and the Welsh triads, if you know the material. And there would be plenty of references to like later Welsh history as well. Even though like Owain Glyndwr was in the 1400s, you could still have a reference to him here and possibly some earlier stuff as well. I see the Welsh as being a skirmishing faction with really good ranged power, but kind of small armies that are kind of slow to create. And your heroes could maybe play a major role in like conscripting soldiers more effectively. You'll notice that for the Welsh and Irish, I have a much better idea of how I would actually build them. And that's because I've actually done Age of Empires 2 builds for both of these factions. If you want to check out the Welsh, go take a look up here. I'll reference the Irish later. For the Welsh major gods, you could look at people like Bailey, the great king ancestor of the Welsh peoples, according to, I believe, the Mabinogion. Or Llywelyn, who was like their golden boy, kind of like their equivalent of the Irish Lugh, as well as Arawn, the Lord of the Underworld, who's a really interesting figure in and of himself. These are arguably not gods again. You could call them saints. I think they are closer to gods, and are likely kind of a Christian reconstruction of Brythonic deities that existed well before Welsh conversion in like the 500s to 600s AD. For myth units, they have a lot of options as well. The Water Leaper, which is like a freaky frog with wings that would jump out of water and grab you. The Afanc, which is like a crocodile, beaver, dragon thing. And the Draig Goch, or the Draig Or, which was the red dragon of Wales, as well as the golden dragon of King Arthur, which Owain Glyndwr actually had on his banner. Really, really cool options here. Now, if you wanted to give the Welsh a more authentic name, you would go with Cymru, probably. But it's kind of hard to sell that, even more than with the Irish, because Welsh is quite an intimidating language for English speakers. Speaking of which, back when I did my original Welsh build, I had quite a few commenters saying, "Oh, Robbie, you gotta pronounce the name of that, like, long-ass Welsh village, right? You gotta do that in your video, don't you?" To which I said, absolutely frickin' not. Like, are you crazy? There is no way I am pronouncing Llanfairpwll Gwyngyll Gogerech Wynthrobo Llantysilio Go Go Go. And there's no way I would take like 3 weeks to learn that for this video. That's insane. Now, you could also include King Arthur in this Welsh faction. And I think most people would. But I personally favor his mythos on a different faction. And speaking of which, let's talk about the Avalonians. This would be the first of the mythic cultures that I am proposing for this list, an Arthurian faction covering the matter of Britain, the kind of body of literature surrounding King Arthur, in its entirety, plus some adjacent Brythonic lore and history. This would almost certainly require that saints like Arthur himself be the gods of this faction, which again, I think is a great option. This would be a classic high medieval faction, because even though the Arthurian mythos originated probably well before the High Middle Ages, it was mostly developed by medieval writers in like the 11 and 1200s AD, and it would have a major emphasis on heroes. You could maybe get favor through doing like quests around the map, which I think would be super cool. And for major saints, we would have Arthur himself, Merlin, Morgan, maybe even Mordred as well. So like the big players in the Arthurian stories. And I think it could be pretty cool if maybe you got like hero avatars of the major and minor saints you choose. This could work for a lot of Age of Mythology cultures, by the way, but I think it might work best here, or at least well enough that I'd really want to experiment with it. Now for myth units, there's a shocking number of really cool myth units in the Arthurian mythos. The Capelus, for example, or the Cathbalu, who is like a murder cat, for want of a better term. The Turtruith, who is like a giant monster boar. And of course the famous Glatisant, the questing beast, final boss of Arthurian mythos, so to speak. Now, while I think that Arthurian lore is actually like a perfect fit for Age of Mythology, and I would love to have an Arthurian faction, I think Avalonians is a garbage name. I was trying to like reference Atlanteans, because like it's another mythical island, but it's actually way more mythical. But you could use something contrived like Camelotians instead. But what I'd personally be more inclined to do would reuse the term Brythons outside of the previously mentioned umbrella, because it would fit King Arthur pretty well, and since I'm planning on splitting that umbrella, that name would be up for grabs. So that's what I would personally do. There is kind of an arbitrary line between this faction and the Welsh, and there's a lot of like options that could fit on either. Arthur is, once again, almost certainly of Welsh origin, but I would be trying my best to distinguish the two and keep their kind of unique themes and identities separate enough that they could both coexist in the game. Now, From here, we move on to long shots. Yeah, all those things I just mentioned, those are not long shots in my book. Now we're getting into the really weird stuff that almost certainly would never, ever get into the game, but I want to talk about anyways, starting with the Scottish. Now, this faction would cover almost all of Scottish medieval history and lore, from Dalriata in like the 5 to 800s, up until its final conquest by England in like the late 1500s AD. Late 1500s, I should reinforce. This would make it a largely high medieval culture, with a lot of Christian influence and even some gunpowder, but I should note pre-Christian practices were like very much alive and well in Scotland during these times, even more so than in medieval Ireland, I should note. So I still think that it can have kind of a pagan feel, even well after the days of Christianization. But even so, I think that the Scottish could be a really interesting faction. They'd be adaptive with like a weak early game, mostly focused on like survival, and then a strong late game if you can build up to it. And they'd have like a lot of stealth and raiding and mobile eco mechanics. Why do I have such a clear vision for this? Well, because I already did a build on the Scots for Age of Empires 2. Go take a look up there if you want to see it. I had this cool idea of maybe the Scots would be unable to build settlements until the heroic age to force village centers instead, because they were very, very decentralized and didn't have a lot of urban centers. In terms of major gods and maybe saints, I think a unique mix of both actually could be even better. I thought it would be cool to have both Beta, who was the divine crone of Celtic mythology in general. In Ireland and also Scotland, she was also called Cailleach, but Beta was the Scottish name for her. And given the Scottish weather, her embodiment as like the turning of the seasons and the all-important power of weather was especially important to them. So she could be like the pagan side of Scotland. And then if we wanted to incorporate saints in the more Christian side, we could have Saint Andrew, the patron saint of Scotland, be the other like major god that you could choose from. So you could kind of choose a pagan or Christian path. Myth units, however, the Scots have no shortage of. Things like the toxic water rat, the lavelan, or the barach vai, which was like a giant horse-sucking leech, as well as the Beithir, which was a great venomous worm that was probably somewhere between a sea serpent and a dragon, and it's complicated, as with all things Celtic mythology. Now, you may ask, why did I put the Scottish below the Welsh and the Irish? Well, firstly, because the Scots as a Celtic people came about much later than the other two, and mostly were just a subset of the Irish for the earlier part of their history in particular, only developing a very unique identity, again, towards like the 1000s AD and beyond. And also because since they would be high medieval and maybe even having some gunpowder elements, I didn't think it would be appropriate for them to be ranked as highly, given that we don't see elements like gunpowder in Age of Mythology yet. Once again, if we're talking authentic names, I propose Albanach instead of Scottish. I think that sounds much cooler. And is also pretty easy to pronounce. Like I was just saying, though, it probably wouldn't work to limit the Scots to being low medieval, like pre-1000 AD. I think they're just too similar to the Irish. There is tons of god and myth overlap, as is with the Irish in particular, so I've tried to be specific here, and if I were to do a full build for this culture, I would be going out of my way to try to keep them as specific and distinct as possible. Though I do fully believe it is doable and would probably make for an extremely fun and unique gameplay experience. Next of the long shots, to talk about the Carolingians. What the heck would these guys be? Well, this would represent the matter of France as a semi-mythical culture. Both the historical and legendary elements of the story of Charlemagne, along with a grab bag of other medieval French folklore. It would obviously have a huge emphasis on cavalry, with very powerful heroes, and rather mediocre myth units. Though, I thought a really cool gimmick could be if some myth units could be rideable by heroes. So you could like mount up your hero on a myth unit, and then if your mount died, the hero would keep fighting on foot. I think that this riding mechanic could work with other factions, but you gotta have it for the Carolingians. Like that was their thing, dude. In terms of some of their major saints, and it would be saints, we'd have, of course, Charlemagne himself, Roland, his second in command, Saint Martin, the patron saint of France, and maybe Saint Joan of Arc. Maybe. I think she's overrated as hell, but maybe. I think, like I mentioned earlier, saints would have like less power than other gods, so worse text, worse myth units, worse powers, but they would be cheaper and easier to get, which I think could be a really cool dynamic within the game and make it so that saint factions feel unique without just being bowled over, and factions that have both saints and gods would have meaningful choices between them. For Carolingian myth unit options, there's a surprising amount of good ones. You have, for example, the Yale, which was like a mythical ibex thing, the Hippogriff, the eagle horses that first featured, mythologically speaking, in the Matter of France, and even the Tarasque, the famous turtle dragon of southern France fame. I think you can probably see what I mean about heroes being able to ride some of these. Now, while the base grounding of this faction is actually like early to high medieval, I think that it would be necessary to represent this faction as being more late medieval in terms of its aesthetic. Maybe even with a little bit of gunpowder. Maybe. Mostly because that's when a lot of the Matter of France was like actually written, and it's also, though I kind of hate to admit it, much of what people expect out of a faction like this. There's probably a better name for this faction than Carolingians, but I couldn't think of one. If you have suggestions, I'd love to hear them. And I do think there's a possibility that this faction could be sub-split, but I'm not sure what would fit best. There's like a lot of French material out there to pack in here, and I don't want to force the issue too much. That said, if we were to do the split, I could see the myth units of this faction refocused onto heraldic beasts, which, if you don't know, have like so much wild material out there, and again fit really, really well with like a chivalry, knightly focused faction where the myth units are meant to be rideable. I think that could be super freaking cool. And frankly, I might end up going with the heraldic beast option either way just because I like the idea so much. Another long shot, another mythical faction, the Seelies. Do you know what Seelies are? Well, they are the fair folk of Celtic myth, the less evil side of the great fairy family, drawing from both Gaelic and Brythonic traditions, which have like a lot of overlap in terms of what they expect out of fair folk. So this does focus on like good fairies, huge scare quotes there. While I say good, all fairies were bastards, right? These ones were just like less hideous and malevolent by default. And so this Seelie faction would be a mythical culture where all the units kind of minorly count as myth units. So they all take bonus damage from heroes and anti-myth stuff just to a lesser degree on average. But they would have some anti-hero specialists to compensate as well, which I think would be super duper cool. In terms of major gods, there's a couple of really interesting ones here. For example, Finbara, the king of the fairies, Cleona, the wicked queen, sometimes not a queen, who would often be a spurned lover and pursue viciously the mortals who slighted her, and even Ina, the Irish summer goddess, who was later referred to in some sources as a queen of fairies herself. The first two on this list, while not gods per se, are very high-profile fairy royalty who recur a lot in stories, so I think they're close enough. For myth units, oh god, you have tons of options here. Like I said, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales have no shortage of myth unit options, so you could put a bunch of them here, the more fairy-inclined ones, like the brownies, the little house fairy spirits, the Cushi, who are like the black fairy dogs, equal parts watchful psychopomp and baleful omen of death, and the Banshee. Not like the evil, screaming killer creatures, but more of like an omen of death, a keening fairy who would warn you of impending disaster and doom. I think that a Seelie faction would actually be a really cool, underrated pick for Age of Mythology. Not only would you have a very varied mortal roster with like an elf-like humanoid baseline, which was widely attested by the way, but you would also have just absolutely enormous variety in terms of what your army could look like and actually do in practice, which seems very, very fun to me. You could also maybe even use better known Shakespearean names for like maybe your gods, like King Oberon rather than Finvara, or Queen Mab. But I personally choose not to do that. But maybe we can reference some of the Shakespearean stuff elsewhere on the build. I think that a faction like this would be a huge hit. You couldn't just dump it in the game as of now. You'd want to have another Celtic faction or two come first. But imagine telling people that they can play as like a court of fairies in Age of Mythology. I think people would go nuts for that. So even though I think this is a long shot, it's a faction I would actually strongly counsel the creators of Age of Mythology to consider way down the line. Related to the Seelies, however, would be the Unseelies. The Unseelies were the bad fairies, enemies of the Seelies and mortals alike, brought together here as a mythical culture as a counterpoint to the Seelies themselves. Again, I say bad here, but all fairies were little shits 99% of the time. These guys were just shits universally rather than most of the time. Now, rather than the Aes-Shi, the folk of the mounds, the Unseelies would be a much more motley crew, which would have like a crappy eco. Like, these guys are not inclined to do hard labor, you know? But they would have even greater variety in terms of their faction. You could even tie them in with the Fomorians, the monstrous race that the Gaelic gods battled against for supremacy, kind of akin to the Greek Titans. The Unseelies, I propose here, could worship the Fomorians as their gods. A much cleaner way to get the Fomorians in the game than the Atlanteans worshipping the Titans as we have currently. Now, for major gods, or Fomorians, we would have Balor, the great destroyer, he of the baleful eye, Elata, the beautiful king of the Fomorians, who seduced the goddess of Ireland herself, Bres, the handsome tyrant who ruled the gods, though of Fomorian origin, and even Caitlin, the great prophetess of the Fomorians, wife of Balor. So you have a lot of great god options here, and plenty more besides. For myth unit options, infinity choices. You have redcaps, the little murder goblins that would come out on battlefields to kill the wounded. The Sloa, the flying host who would pluck you away and draw you up into the sky. The Dullahan, the famous headless horseman. There are so many cool Unseelies out there. They absolutely need to be included in the game. I don't doubt many of these Unseelies could be myth units for like umbrella factions I've mentioned earlier. They're so iconic and cool. But I'd love to have them all brought together here as one wicked court. That sounds so fun. A lot of what I said about the Seelie faction would also apply here. This would be like an all myth unit faction with, like I said, enormous variety. And in my opinion, of this entire video, this is the faction I would have the most fun making personally. It's like very much my style. You could also even call this faction Fomorians instead of Unseelies, but I think it's personally less appropriate. Now, last of the long shots, we have the Milesians. Who the heck are they, you might say? Well, these would be the later Christian Irish, who were like retroactively represented in myth as conquering Ireland from the Irish pagan gods, the Tuatha De Danann. And this faction would represent Ireland from like 700-ish AD onwards, with like a couple earlier pieces as well. So it would be kind of like the sister to the Irish faction I proposed earlier, covering a lot of the island's later history. It would have a very much high medieval flavor with a big focus on Christianity, very limited myth units, but having a lot of strength versus enemy myth units. Irish saints were known for battling their monsters, let me put it that way. So the cutoff for this faction would probably be around like the 1400s-ish, when the English lost control of the island, with maybe a couple references after then as well. But for their major saints, we would see, for example, St. Patrick, the patron of Ireland, St. Bride, or Brigid, who's the patroness of Ireland, possibly a euhemerization of the Celtic goddess Brigid, which I think is a pretty compelling theory. And lastly, St. Columba, or Columcille, the tertiary patron of Ireland, who is almost certainly a real person as well. In fact, I talk about him, as well as a lot of other medieval Irish history, in my build for them for Age of Empires, which you can check out up here. For myth unit options, I think the Milesians would have a really interesting myth unit dynamic. A lot of their myth units would be like monsters that their saints destroyed. For example, the Ligna Paist, which was the last serpent of Ireland. The island without serpents, of course. St. Patrick did that work. Also, the Cathach, which was like an island monster, again, driven away by a saint. And the Shile, which was like a multi-eyed sea serpent thing. So again, you can see a lot of like water monsters, which could be a downside, as I'll get to momentarily. I should note, you could, instead of using the term Milesians, you could call this civilization maybe the Hibernians as well, or even just plain old Irish. Though I think I kind of prefer Milesians, and I would only use Irish if we did Eirene for the like early Irish faction. The myth units for this faction could get repetitive. It's, you know, as a water dragon killed by saint, whatever the hell. So I'd want like a really cool gimmick to both represent the limited nature of myth units for this faction and make it feel a little more thematic for them. So here's my idea. What if you needed to tame the myth units out on the map before you made more? I think that could be super duper cool, you know? The saint goes out, it says, sign of the cross, get out of here, you bitch, and then the monster fights for you from then on. Oh, I think that sounds sick. And it would be a cool way to limit the myth units without just making them garbo. So tell me what you think about that gimmick. I like it a lot. And now, my friends, we get in to the final part of this list, the mega long shots. These are the cultures that are never getting into the game, but I can dream. And I want to share with you, because I think there's some really cool options here, beginning with the Hebrideans. This would be an unusual umbrella civilization covering the Hebrides, the Isle of Man, Shetland, and Orkney, primarily grounded in the Norse Kingdom of the Isles, which controlled pretty much all of the above for a good period of time, as well as a lot of the later folklore and culture that developed out of the unique intersection between Norse and Celtic that was emblematic of these islands off of Scotland. These regions have a ton of lore, like way more than you would expect, and it would be a naval-focused faction, of course. Though it would be extremely messy to do this, I think it could be really cool to have a unique mechanic for these guys where they would always spawn with like a big body of water taking up a chunk of the map nearby. Like even if you're playing on Acropolis, they'd have a big body of water. I know that would be a nightmare, but it would be cool. So just keep it in mind. That's the sort of thing I would want to try to do with them. For major gods, you actually have a lot of really unique options. For example, the sea mither, the mither of the sea, who is said to keep at bay the storms and demons of the ocean, such as Terran, the great wrathful god of storms. And then as a third weirder option, you have Shoni, who is like a water spirit who could be bribed with alcohol to predict the future. He's Hebridean in origin and probably derived from a much earlier god cult, even though by the time these ceremonies were documented, he had been relegated to mostly like a local tradition, you know what I mean? But I think it could still be super cool and does feel kind of goddish to me, at least. In terms of myth unit options, the Isles have loads. First of all, the Wolvers, the friendly fisherman wolfmen. You don't hear that combination every day. Or the Blue Men of the Minch, were these like sea spirits that would try to capsize boats if you couldn't rhyme to them properly. And then possibly the most horrific mythical creature in the entirety of the world, the Nukkalavi. It was considered the most malevolent and dangerous demon in all of Orkney, and its legends spread throughout the rest of the Isles as well. For other notes, the Hebrideans would be a suboptimal name. Obviously, the Hebrides is just one part of this equation. I did consider Islanders, but god, that's just so lame. You could maybe do something with the Norse terms of Sodor and Nodor. They used Sodor to refer to the southern Isles of Man and the Hebrides, and then Nodor to refer to the northern Isles of Orkney and Shetland, but I don't know, there's something about that that doesn't quite feel right. Plus, if your children have been watching Thomas the Tank Engine like mine do, then the term Sodor would probably make you chuckle. Even though this faction would be incredibly unlikely to actually be added, this is my personal pick for the most underrated British Isles faction. There is an enormous amount of myth potential here, and it's also a really cool link culture to connect the Celtic factions to the Norse. It really is the bridge between the two. And because of that, even though it's super unlikely, I will almost 100% commit to doing this on my channel at some point in future, even if it's several years down the line. Next, of the mega longshots, the Bretons, the people of Brittany, encapsulating its lore and history in northwestern France. This might seem very specific, like what the heck, Brittany? But there's a lot of material here. Brittany was a link between the mainland and the British Celts, and Brittany remained distinctly Celtic even after 1000 AD, and many Celtic practices lingered here well into the High Middle Ages, and there's some evidence of them even today. Another notable feature of the lore of Brittany would be the myth of Ys, a sunken city, which kind of parallels Atlantis, but is way more organic and actually a developed myth, rather than just being a literary construct used by Plato to win an argument. The Bretons would probably be a distinctly medieval culture in practice, blending like a lot of early and later elements, but settling in like a kind of high medieval sort of midpoint. And they would be a saint-focused faction, even though they would have a lot of pagan elements underneath this Christian layer. Saint Yves, the patron saint of Brittany, Saint Corentin, the head of the 7 founding saints of Brittany, and Saint Caddo, a major missionary saint from Wales, could all be some of its major offerings. And Brittany, I think, has like a couple hundred unique saints, meaning that we'd have no shortage of minor god options as well. For myth units, I mentioned a couple of Breton options earlier, and there are plenty more besides, like the Corrigan, these wicked water dwarves, or Jan Gant Itan, an ogre with a hand of candles, kind of the midpoint between a boogeyman and a will-o-wisp. I love this mythical creature, one of my favorites of all time. And lastly, the Anku, a death spirit often represented with an actual scythe. But despite it being super cool, this is one of the only entries on this list that I think I might actually have trouble with actually putting together. Brittany is such a melting pot that it has a lot of crossover with its neighbors. It has like some Arthurian elements, as well as plenty of other Welsh and Cornish elements it obviously takes from France, so there's a chance I wouldn't have enough material, but I'm still confident enough to give it a solid try. That being said, a faction I'm a little bit less optimistic about would be the Picts. This would be a rough mashup of all of the non-Welsh, non-Arthurian Brythonic Celts, most notably the Picts and the Cornish, along with some other adjacent material that didn't fit into the other Brythonic factions. For example, the Fir Bolg of Irish post-Christian mythology and a bunch of the other like settler peoples that are referenced there are sometimes connected to Brythonic Celts, like mythological representations among the Irish of the Celts who inhabited the Isles before they arrived. So maybe some of that mythos could be on the table for a Pictish faction as well. In fact, I personally think it's a very compelling way of doing it. You could kind of think of this as being like a dump faction, to put all the cool stuff that couldn't fit into the Welsh, Avalonians, and Breton factions. There were definitely some myths that fit better here than elsewhere, though, so don't just think of it as being the day-old Chile of the Brythonic peoples. For example, the myth of Lyonesse, another sunken city that closely parallels Ys, is directly and unambiguously connected to Cornwall. This Picts faction would have like a pre-medieval aesthetic, because I'd be calling it the Picts, but it would still have some later stuff bundled in as well, and it would have a heavy dose of whimsy. Cornish mythology in particular is so goofy and quaint that I think it would give it a very different flavor from a lot of the other factions that I think helps distinguish and justify it as being its own unique thing. For saints, because it would be saint-based, you could have Saint Perron, the main patron of Cornwall, Saint Petroc, another patron saint of Cornwall, as well as Cessair, who I think is a bit of a stretch. She was the leader of the first mythical group of settlers who inhabited the British Isles in post-Christian Irish mythology. And I think if we're going like the Fear Bolg route, she could work pretty well, but like I said, it is maybe a bit of a stretch. I think I could probably make it work, though. For myth units, there's no shortage. You have Piskies, like shitty little fairies. We know them better as pixies. The Knockers, which are like little mine fairies, which would tap on walls to trick you. And Blunderbores. This was the name of quite a few different giants in Cornish folklore. Great monstrous giants are an absolute fixture of them, as Jack the Giant Killer famously originates from Cornwall. So having a bunch of big nasty giants around is definitely going to be a mainstay of this particular faction. Though I will say, I think that this Pictish faction is the single biggest stretch on this list, especially the Fear Bolg stuff. So I wouldn't be too sad if this one didn't work out, but I still want to give it a try. That said, we now move on to the last faction on this list, and possibly the weirdest one, the Fable Beasts. Now, what the hell do I mean by this? Well, this would be a mythical culture composed entirely of anthropomorphized animals. This might seem like super random, but tales of anthropomorphic animals were frequently used in the Middle Ages as parodies of courtly love and chivalric stories in the medieval world. You could think of them as like political cartoons before that was a thing, and they were even able to criticize the church, hiding under a layer of plausible deniability and humor. These beast fables were common all across West Europe and Germany, but they were especially prevalent in France. And I should note, animals are used in like all sorts of folklore, of course, but this faction would focus on these satirical beast stories that were trying to make fun of stories such as the Matter of France and the Matter of Britain through this anthropomorphic lens. So kind of like with the Seelies and Unseelies, all of the units in this faction would be like part myth unit, right? But they would also have a very extensive array of heroes, a very hero-focused faction. And I love this gimmick. Each unit could spawn as a random animal with slightly different stats. So like rabbits, for example, could be fast but have low HP, whereas boars would have like slow acceleration speed but have good attack and HP, something like that. I think it could be super duper fun. Now, I would have their major gods termed as saints, though neither are really appropriate. Major characters, maybe. The classic being Reynard the Fox. You've probably heard of him. He is the emblematic fable beast, and his stories would be a big part of what this faction is concentrated around. But so too would be his uncle and main antagonist, Isengrim the Wolf, as well as Noble, the king lion who presided over the world of Reynard, Isengrim, and company. For myth unit options, I'll be honest, this was kind of a tricky one. I didn't want to go too deep into the weeds for myth units here, especially because this faction would have like all of its units be partially myth. But let me leave you with one option. You ever heard of snail knights? If you've never before, look them up, and you're in for a treat. God, they're so much fun. Medieval monks would clearly get super bored writing manuscripts, and they would make these like weird, goofy little doodles in the margins of their text, often depicting anthropomorphic animals fighting each other or talking to each other or jousting, oftentimes riding on snails. One of the many cute, more obscure pieces of lore that can bundle together to bring this faction to life. I genuinely believe in this one, guys. It's really weird, it's stupidly unlikely, but I genuinely love it. I think it like fits shockingly well into the game. It's like very, very authentic to an actual body of real world lore, and it's completely unlike any faction you could put in Age of Mythology from anywhere else around the world. So even though this is the bottom of my list, it's high in my heart. It would be super duper fun to put together. But with that, we now move on to a couple final points I wanted to leave you guys with before closing, because this has been a long one. Thank you for bearing with me. First, I wanted to talk about some other possibilities. There are plenty of adjacent cultures that could have been in this video, but were cut for time. Especially German peoples like the Saxons, who were profoundly important in the British Isles. Could also even make a case for the Normans. So why didn't I include them? It was getting long enough already. And since they're culturally closer to like the Central Northern Europe region. I'm going to save them for there. You could argue, oh, but you did the Hebrideans, and those are Norse. Well, they're half Norse. They're also half Celtic. So I felt it was appropriate to have them here. Another adjacent people that we could have talked about would be the Celtiberians of Spain. Spain had enormous Celtic presence and was probably an origin point for the Gaels before they immigrated up into Ireland and then into Scotland. But, similar to what I just said, I needed to make cuts for time. So the Celtiberians and their connected cultures like the Basques and the Galicians and the Lusitanians are being saved for a future video as well. I also thought about a couple of post-medieval cultures, and I'm sure there's many more besides these, such as maybe a proper Cornish faction that could focus on English pirate mythos, like Davy Jones and shit. Oh, that would be so awesome. I think people would go nuts for it. But it's too far afield of the time frame for me to want to talk about it yet, though I do think there could be room for stuff like this in the game. Another one that I thought of would be like an industrial era pan-British culture. It would definitely be a stretch, but there's like a shocking amount of good mythos to draw on for this, besides gods, which is another big limiter here. I couldn't even figure out a whole lot of good saints that could work for this, so we're going to save these two for another day, though I think there is possible promise in both of them. It's just a lower priority for me than the medieval and earlier stuff that fits better with Age of Mythology as it exists currently. The last thing I wanted to touch upon is why so many factions. I genuinely don't believe there is an upper limit on how many cultures could be added to Age of Mythology. When there is material for it, I think a faction should be attempted. And of the 14 cultures on this list, there is only one, well, maybe two, that I'm not sure I could actually make work. I do plan on doing further episodes in this little series of adding factions to Age of Mythology, but later episodes will probably have fewer entries. The reason that this first entry has so many is that, like I mentioned, Celtic and especially Gaelic mythology is a bit of a personal specialty and hobby of mine, so I just happen to know a lot about it and happen to believe very profoundly that there is enough material for an absolute ton of factions, way more than I think most people would believe in. But with that, we finally come to the end of this monstrous list. Thank you guys so much for watching. Now I want to hear from you all. Do you think I missed any candidates for this list? I know 14 is a big number, but I'm happy to hear more if you think there's room for more, especially for things like a Gaul subsplit or a France subsplit, some of the areas that I have less personal knowledge about. Also, I want to hear, what is your personal cutoff? Did you like the options that I listed here? And if so, how many of them would you personally like to see added to the game? I know I'd want to see all of them, but I'm weird that way, and I don't expect you all will share that opinion. So what's your personal cutoff for this list? And lastly, and most importantly, where in the world shall we go next for this series? Where do you want to see me do a deep dive on to see how many cultures we could possibly add to the game? Because I really liked doing... But until then, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.